One of the most common things I get asked by students when I'm running a photo walk or a class is how do I learn to use the settings on my camera? How to choose the numbers on a film camera that has manual settings rather than auto. So welcome back to Pushing Film, everyone. This is going to be a brief video going over some of the basic settings that apply to shooting photography manually, whether it's film or digital, but in this video we're going to focus on film. So if you're just getting into photography and using manual settings, especially if it's because you've picked up a film camera that only has manual settings, it's important to understand three basic things, which are the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture that you can control on your camera. So to get the first thing out of the way, when you load a new roll of film into your camera, you need to set the ISO. I talk a little bit about this in my video on loading a film camera, and I have another video which is beginner tips for shooting film. I'll put a link to both of those videos in the description, and it's worth watching both. And I mentioned a really important thing in my tips video, which is it's worth practicing on a digital camera if you have access to one before you go ahead and burn through a whole bunch of film. So when it comes to the ISO, it's a pretty easy thing. You set it and forget it. Once you set the ISO after loading a roll of film, you don't change it throughout shooting that roll. And it's as easy as choosing the ISO number that matches the film that you're shooting. A really important thing worth knowing is that if you're shooting any negative film, which is most of the regular film that you buy at a store, including all color negative film and even black and white film, you can set the ISO at whatever it says on the box or even lower. So for example, if I was shooting a 400 speed film like Portra 400, sometimes I'll set the ISO at 200 or anywhere between 200 and 400. Now, before I explain the reason that I do this, it's also important to understand one thing about setting the ISO on your camera. All that setting the ISO number on your camera does is it tells the light meter how to act, how to behave, how to read light. So by putting a lower number into the light meter, by putting a lower ISO number, I'm actually telling it that the film is less sensitive, meaning it's going to give the film more light. And the reason that's good for especially color negative film is that it tends to give you results that are a little bit brighter, cleaner, with more detail on the shadows. Now, I really like this aspect of being able to choose different ISO settings on your camera because it's going to give you different creative effects. So if you do what I mentioned and shoot the film at a lower speed, giving it more light, that means you're going to get that cleaner look. But if you shoot at box speed, or let's say a higher number, giving it less light, underexposing it a little bit, you're actually going to get a more grungy, moody, and grainy result. So if you like that, go ahead and do that. And this is probably one of the reasons why you're getting into shooting manually, is because you want more creative control over your photos. There's one thing worth keeping in mind, and that is if you're shooting a slide film like this roll of Ektachrome or Fuji Velvia or any color reversal film, you shouldn't change the ISO number from what it says on the box. You should set the ISO to exactly what it says and leave it for the whole roll, because it's not as forgiving with changes to exposure and being over or underexposed when it comes to slide film. Okay, so you've set the ISO on your camera and you forget about it. Now, what if your camera doesn't have a light meter? So that means you're going to actually need to use an external light meter. And that could be either a small handheld meter like this, or you can actually these days just download an app on your phone and use that. There's a lot of free apps, so if you just search the App Store or Google Play Store, you'll find a good free light meter app and be able to use that, because these handheld meters aren't always the cheapest. So what's the point of the meter that I keep talking about? Whether using a handheld one or following the light meter that you see when you look through the viewfinder, it's so that you can dial in the correct exposure according to how much light is in your scene. So that's why using a higher speed film is appropriate for situations with lower light, and using a lower speed film is good in bright conditions. And once we move past the ISO, we're left with two important settings, which are shutter speed and aperture. These are the two main things controlling how much light hits the film and exposes the image. And these two settings have a much more creative effect as well compared to the ISO. So the first thing is shutter speed. Now the shutter speed, it might seem pretty obvious, but it's making your shutter speed fire at a lower speed or a higher speed. So a really important rule of thumb when it comes to setting your shutter speed is you shouldn't go too slow on the shutter. If you were to choose that really slow shutter speed like I demonstrated before, you're likely to get motion blur from the movement of your own hands. And at which speed do you start to get motion blur? Well, that depends on the lens you're using. And there's a really easy rule of thumb to follow, which is don't set the shutter speed lower than what the focal length of your lens is. So if I'm using a 50mm lens, don't go lower than about 50 on the shutter speed dial. Now my shutter speed dial doesn't have 50, so I wouldn't go lower than 60. And if you want to be safe, you can even double that number and not go lower than, say, 100 with a 50mm lens. So all that's doing is giving you a bit of a safeguard and a guide to the sort of minimum speed you should use when you're shooting handheld. Now you can go a bit lower if you trust that you can stay pretty still, or maybe if you use a tripod, then you can go a lot slower on the shutter speed. But for day-to-day shooting handheld, go between your minimum, depending on the lens you're shooting, and whatever the highest shutter speed is that your camera can go to. Now what's the creative effect with shutter speed? So basically you're going to control how much motion you freeze. If you shoot at a 60th of a second with a car driving past, that car is going to probably be a little bit blurred. Whereas if you want to freeze that action, you would use a higher shutter speed. But more importantly, the shutter speed is controlling how much light's coming in, so you need to follow the light meter. When it comes to setting the shutter speed or aperture, I'm going to keep repeating that you need to look at the light meter inside your camera or that separate handheld meter and use the settings that are right according to the light, the situation that you're shooting in. So the next factor controlling light is the aperture setting. Most of the time this is controlled by a ring on the front of your lens. So the aperture basically uses an iris inside the lens to allow more or less light in. So as you change that setting and the shutter speed, you'll notice that the light meter reading is changing, and you're always trying to get the light meter to read correct, or sometimes it shows as in the middle or some kind of dot. It's usually pretty easy to figure out, but you need to set it according to how much light is in your scene. And you'll notice as you change aperture, it opens up some ability to move shutter speed and vice versa. So it's a delicate balance of both of those aspects to shoot manually. You control the amount of light getting in using aperture and shutter speed. So the next thing to know about is what is the creative aspect of setting the aperture on your lens. Now this is going to control what's called depth of field, or how much of your image is in focus. The easiest way to remember this is that the smaller numbers, the lower numbers on your lens, like let's say 1.4 or 2 or 2.8, they're going to give me less in focus. Small number, less in focus. So for example, if I was shooting a portrait of a friend, I use a low aperture number, they will be in focus and the background will be completely blurred out. Another important tip I try to tell people is don't use the lowest number or wide open aperture on your lens all the time unless you really trust your focus. The thing about using a really low aperture number or f-stop, like let's say 1.4 or 1.8, is that if you move or misfocus a little bit, it can completely ruin the shot. So what I usually recommend is clicking down 1 or 2 clicks on your aperture to get that little bit more safeguard in your focus and get a sharper shot. But again, when it comes to aperture, you want to follow the light meter, set that according to what the light meter reads and whatever you've set on your shutter speed. And it's about deciding whether the aperture or how much is in focus is priority, or the shutter speed or how much motion you're trying to freeze or let blur. That's why a lot of cameras have an aperture priority mode or a shutter priority mode. So don't let it get too complicated and just get out there and practice. Just know to follow the light meter, set the ISO and don't change it throughout the roll, and practice with a digital camera if you can. Because by seeing the shots on the back of the screen, you're going to have a much better understanding of how these numbers affect your photos, and it all follows the same basic concepts. So I hope this video makes it a little bit less scary confronting all the settings and numbers on your camera, and once you realize what they're doing, it's really not that hard. Follow these tips that I've given you in this video and get out there and practice. Thanks guys, and I'll see you on the next Pushing Film episode. Bye.